thanks for joining today for this webinar to talk about Next.js 12.2, hear about some of the features we released recently, and pull up some code and actually take a look at how these features work. I'm Lee. I'm the VP of Developer Experience here at Vercel, and I've been leading the Next.js community, trying to help educate you all on the new features we've released and talk about how they can make you a better web developer and help you build better web applications. So I'm super excited today to actually get to talk through a lot of these and explain some of the terminology and concepts that you might be unfamiliar with or familiar with and give you a new understanding of how these things work. So chime in the chat. I want to go over just a couple quick housekeeping things here before we get into the bulk of the talk today. There are audio settings on the bottom if you want to change your audio, and if you click Q&A, this is where the questions will be sent for me to answer. It's just a little bit easier to keep track of than in chat, but feel free to do live chat as well as we dive into this. And you don't need to use raise hand or anything like that, but rest assured that this recording will be available on YouTube for you to watch after. So I see some people tuning in from Spain, from New Hampshire, from Philly, New York City, Netherlands, Sri Lanka, Chile, Lithuania, Miami, Oregon, California, just everywhere. Kenya, Sacramento, Colombia. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to tune in and hear about this. London, Amsterdam, South Africa, all over. The entire world is here today. I'm super excited. So today we're going to be talking about first some level setting on some of the terminology I'm going to be using and what these products and what these features mean. And then we're just going to run through a laundry list of really interesting and exciting features and things related to Next.js 12.2 and Vercel. So Edge middleware, API routes, server rendering, on-demand ISR, the new image component, an update on the much awaited, much anticipated layouts work in Next.js, as well as making sure we have plenty of time to answer all of your questions. So let's jump into it. The first things first is I want to talk about some of the terminology and how all of these things play out into you making a request to a browser and then actually connecting to some tool like a database at the end of the request. Now, this portion of the terminology is a little bit more focused on the Vercel flow, but I think it's helpful to understand how all these pieces fit together. So you as a visitor of a website, you make a request in your browser, and that hits an edge network like a Vercel. And the first thing that runs, or the first thing that is evaluated, is Edge middleware. Now, Edge middleware is a new feature that we have included in Next.js that works open source with any host that you want to deploy it on. And then when you deploy this to Vercel, it can run on our edge network in a specific region or on a specific edge. And it allows you to run some dynamic code before you serve up some file or some HTML, CSS, or JavaScript. Now, the type of code that you run with Edge middleware is likely something like a request or a redirect, a rewrite, headers, and the applications of these are things like A/B testing or feature flags. We'll get into this a little bit more here in a second. So the middleware runs and it gets pushed next to the cache. This is where you have the static files, whether it's HTML files for pages, JavaScript files to add some interactivity, CSS files for styling, web fonts. All of these things then get evaluated and determine which need to be served up to the incoming request in the incoming visitor. Then you might run some additional logic with a function, whether that's running on serverless infrastructure or edge infrastructure. We'll show some demos of that in a minute. And then finally, you can connect to your favorite tools, your databases, your CMSs, your blob storage, your cron job, all of these different tools that you have in your toolbox, in your arsenal to build out your web application. So that's kind of the topology of the request that's being made in the system. And the first piece specifically that I want to dive into is Edge middleware, which I like to think of as dynamic at the speed of static. So before Edge middleware, a lot of developers in the larger Next.js ecosystem and really the front end ecosystem had to make this binary choice of, do I want to have great performance with a static site, or do I want to have a dynamic personalized experience? And it was really difficult to do both of those at the same time. And what Edge middleware is hoping to solve is it's hoping to make it easy for you to get that dynamic website with that flexibility, with that personalization at the same speed as serving up a static HTML file from an Edge cache. So if I extend our original topology just a little bit further, we have the browser, the cache, then the middleware, and then the Edge network cache. I really like using these type of diagrams to illustrate how the request flows through the system, because it helps me understand at what order each piece runs. So we're going to dissect Edge middleware, and we're going to look at some of the specific examples, like maybe you want to do an A/B test or an experiment for an e-commerce site, where if I land on the homepage, depending on the experiment or the flag that the customer is in, they should see different content. Maybe you want to use middleware to change up the section of a page, whether a customer is subscribed or not subscribed in the instance of a news site. This can also be possible with middleware. Maybe you want to do some kind of personalized, localized content on the screen, depending on the user's location, or for compliance or regulatory requirements, you might need to restrict some pages or some locations from viewing a specific route, and you can also enable this through middleware. So the larger theme here is middleware is this primitive that's giving you control over how you do routing in your application and how you can enable both a fast website while still handling these complex and often complicated different product use cases that previously you would have had that binary decision of choosing between the two. So I know the audience here, a lot of folks tuning in are excited about the code. They're excited about seeing some of these things in the editor. They don't want to see Google Slides. So I'm going to jump over to the code and actually pull up what some of this stuff looks like. So first things first here, I have my editor on the left and I have browser on the right. And I want to first start by talking about middleware. So middleware is defined through a root middleware file in your repository. So on the left, this is just a basic hello world Next.js application, and I made a brand new middleware file here. Now in this file, there's a couple things to note. First is I have this config that has a matcher. This is telling my application, whether it's Next.js or any front-end framework, what routes this code should run on. So you can think of this function as this little dynamic snippet of code that you want to run for some subset of routes. In this instance, we want to run it just for the home page. Now, I talked about product use cases of middleware. Like, how would I actually want to implement this and use this for real things when building real products? Let's talk about A/B testing. So I land on my home page. Now, I have some condition that in this instance, we're going to simplify down to just a 50% of visitors. If they're in this bucket, I want to rewrite them to a different variation of the page. And we can do this through middleware. So let's walk through this snippet of code that's actually enabling this. First, we define a cookie. So we're just going to call this cookie an A/B test. If it doesn't already exist, we're going to just randomly pick a number and we're going to show this to 50% of visitors. Now, this works because we're persisting this value to a cookie. So on refresh, you wouldn't rerun that logic again. So there's two buckets, new or old. And depending on that, there's two different paths we're going to write to. Either the home page, which is kind of the control or the you're not in the segment, or there's this new fancy page and we want to rewrite to that page. Now, depending on that URL, we actually use this code to rewrite it, and then we persist that value to a cookie. So what does this look like? Well, on the right, I've got my dev server running here. I reload the page and I'm seeing home. So I go to pages/index And all this is doing is a very simple React component that's just rendering H1 of home. But if I pull up my console and I go into application and I go into cookies and I go into right here, I see A/B test. This is for localhost 3000. And you see the value is old. And that's why when I refresh the page, I'm still seeing this, our control case of our A/B test. Like this is when I'm not in the new fancy page. But what if I manually changed this to new, or if this was my first time visiting the page, I was in the other 50% of the bucket. Now, when I reload the page, our middleware is taking control of that routing phase and directing traffic to the new page. Now, new, again, it's just a simple page with a simple React component that says new. But I think this illustrates the fact that there's two pieces that could be swapped out here to be really whatever you want. And that's the flexibility that middleware is providing. The first is the logic for determining when a person is in a bucket. So right now, while we've math.randomed this could be from an external provider like a LaunchDarkly. It could be from an external provider like an Optimizely. There's these really sophisticated SaaS tools that can allow you to really take this far. And the code doesn't change that much. Instead of this, you're making an API call, a fetch, it could just be await fetch, and then some URL. It could be a Redis instance even. And then based on that result, you're able to determine what bucket the person is in. The second is that you have full flexibility over where you're rewriting to. And this gets into a little bit more conceptually about the type of code that can run in middleware. I just quickly noticed someone asked if middleware can be async, and the answer is absolutely yes. So you could mark this as async, wrong spot. You can mark this as async, and then you'd be able to do your, const result, await, fetch. GitHub Copilot giving me a random JSON API response. So that's kind of cool. But what's interesting is if you look at the signature here and the type of APIs that we're working with, we have this next request and next response. Now, these aren't actually really anything special. These are an extension of the standard web APIs that are provided in edge infrastructure environments as well as in the browser. So if you were to Google MDM response API, for example, this is essentially the same thing as next response. When you're building a new URL, this is a standard web API. To dive in this a little bit more, we actually have a list of the supported APIs inside of this world in this edge runtime, and they're all listed out here in case you're curious. I'll touch on this edge runtime a little bit more here as we progress, but this is kind of a key piece because this is the environment that middleware runs in. Now you might be wondering, okay, but why? Why would we restrict our environment to have less APIs than the full featured world of Node.js? And the answer is performance. So the trade-off here is by limiting the scope or the surface area of the runtime, you're able to enable greater performance. So by stripping this back to only the most critical APIs needed for speed and security in this environment, we can achieve great performance when running this on edge infrastructure. That's really the big story around edge middleware and how this code, this little function can be turned into a primitive you can use for so many really amazing product use cases. So I see a question about the reason why we wanted to extend, just the request and the response and add a little bit more syntactical sugar, I guess. The big reason here is developer experience. Like if you look at the typing for next request, you're going to see standard web APIs. We've essentially augmented this with some additional information to improve the developer experience. Like for example, if you deploy to Vercel, we can populate more information from the request, like a user's geolocation and mark what city or region the incoming request or incoming visitor is coming from. So that's really the main reason for that. But if you pull off the mask meme of what this is, it's just standard web APIs. So that's really the story with Edge middleware. Now, the other thing we talked about in the Next.js 12.2 release is Edge API routes. And you'll note that it's denoted with Edge again. And the reason for that is because it uses this same Edge runtime. Middleware, Edge API routes, and Edge server rendering all run in this same world with a slimmed down version of the APIs, but they can enable really great performance. So what does that look like? Well, inside pages/ABI/hello, I have our hello world Edge API route. And if I actually go over here and navigate to this, we'll go to API/hello. You see that I get back just some text response here. Hello from my route. I'm an Edge API route. Now, inside of this function, we're able to opt in away from a Node.js runtime and into our Edge runtime using this config object anywhere inside of our file. And then when we start to look at the API signature for an Edge API route, this goes back to what I was talking about with web standard requests and web standard responses. So anywhere you can use a response, you can use that same syntax inside of an Edge API route. The beauty of this is you learn it once and you write it everywhere. Recently, I was working on a SvelteKit project, and my response, you can return some headers, and there's a specific format in doing that. And I was able to basically copy paste or reuse my knowledge of how response worked and apply that same logic in my Next.js project. So I love that by betting on the open web and having an open platform, we can really align on these web APIs. Now, I don't have too much more to say about Edge API routes other than the main difference here is in performance. So when you were deploying an API route to a provider like a Vercel, and you were deploying it as a serverless function before, you might have witnessed or heard about the dreaded cold start. And now the reason for this is that to make your code scalable, we want to not invoke it until it's actually needed. Now, if no one has called that code in days, that function is going to be cold. It hasn't been accessed recently. Kind of similar to how it would be if you were looking up something from a cache. Like it's a cache miss because the file is not there. So the function's cold, and to boot that function up for the first time, it requires a little bit of work. Now, the larger that runtime is, the more work it is to boot up that function. That's the great thing about Edge API routes and using an Edge runtime is the amount of code needed to boot up is much smaller. Thus, you have basically no cold starts. The cold start is very, very small, maybe on the order of 3 to 5 milliseconds, for example. Now, if you add a ton of code, it does add to the cold start, but the baseline is significantly smaller in an Edge runtime versus a serverless runtime. The next Edge-related topic to talk about is Edge server rendering. So if I go over to this page, SSR, pages/SSR, if I were to remove this and save the page, and then I go to localhost 3000, SSR, you'll see I'm gonna server render this page that just says, hello, Lee Rob. Now, all this page is doing is a get server-side props function to do server-side rendering. I return some prop Lee Rob and I forward it to my React component. And then I use that value, that dynamic value that we determined on the fly to generate the markup or the HTML from the server. So if you were to actually inspect this document that we're retrieving from the server, you would notice that we're getting the markup, the HTML, the hello Lee Rob on the request from the server. So we're building this on the fly. Now, when you do this, let's say I was going to run yarn build and build my application here, you'll notice in the output on SSR here, there's this icon, which denotes that it is server-side rendered, and it's using this Lambda icon. Now, what happens if I export const experimental edge and I rerun the build? If I were to run this on my local dev server and reload the page, it would functionally look exactly the same. But there's something unique happening here, which is by using this config, it's opting in this page into this Edge runtime. And this is really exciting because all those benefits I talked about for performance can now apply to your APIs as well. So for example, let's say you wanted to build a completely serverless GraphQL API with a bunch of endpoints. And maybe you had previously battled with trying to deal with cold starts or really trying to improve the performance. Edge API routes are going to help you much more easily achieve the performance and the scalability that you're looking for, also while being very efficient and cost effective. So that's kind of my large story on Edge. I'm happy to take any questions related to how this world kind of meshes together. Maybe I'll take a break right now and a pause to talk about Edge before I jump into the next topic. So there was a question here about why to use rewrites instead of redirects. And I think this is really important. If I go back to my homepage, and you'll notice that the URL I'm looking at is localhost 3000. And I'm in the new segment. I'm in the new A/B test. Now, normally, like if I go to localhost 3000/new, I'm seeing the exact same page. This would be a redirect because the URL is actually changing. When I'm doing a rewrite, this is the sneaky way. From a customer's point of view, nothing changes. I'm still going to mysite.com, but behind the scenes, the server is able to send up different HTML from the edge, depending on what test or what bucket you're in. There's another question. How do we handle a rewrite when there's no response if a page is 404ing? So inside of your middleware, for example, we want to respond when there's no page. I think in that instance, we could probably do a check. Well, ideally, it kind of depends on your application architecture. Like, are these URLs known ahead of time? But we could check if that route exists. And if it does exist, then we know whether we want to rewrite or not. But I'd love to hear a follow-up on that, on like specifically why you're wanting to check for a 404 and what the use case is there. There's a question about matchers in middleware. Does matcher index route mean only the root or all URLs? So this means only the root. This actually supports regex as well too. So you can do a regex in here. You can also do an array if you wanted this to also run on like slash about. But by default, if there's no matcher, the middleware will run on every request in your application. There's a question about using the Edge runtime and where that is supported. So the interesting thing about the Edge runtime is, since it's built on web standard APIs, we were actually able to build this package called the Edge runtime, which is not for application developers. It's for framework authors. But this is a collaboration between Vercel, Cloudflare, Deno, Shopify, all these folks to build essentially the spec of APIs that's compatible with all of these environments. So if you write code that's compliant in a Winter CG, which is the community group that we're all in together, in a Edge runtime compatible or compliant way, you can use it in those different places. And that's really exciting for me, just wanting to make sure that we're betting and aligning on web standards. So that's really great. I think that's most of the questions I see on Edge for now. So I'm going to keep moving on, and I will make sure that we have time to swing back to more questions as well too. So let's talk about on-demand ISR. This is a fun one for me, and I would encourage y'all to check out this demo and try it as well too. I'll drop it in the chat if you want to try it. But on-demand ISR allows you to get a lot of the benefits of a really fast static website while still keeping your builds low and updating content when it changes. So this is kind of the happy medium in between fully static website, fully server rendered website. ISR kind of sits somewhere in the middle where it can do a little bit of both. It's truly hybrid. So for example, on this demo, it's hooked up to a Git repository. And if I go out here and look at it, people can file issues, and those issues then show up inside of this repository using the GitHub API. Now, let's say for example, we have testing here that was opened up 6 hours ago. If I go in here and let's say I want to say, hello, everyone watching live, and I want to leave a comment. Now, normally the way that ISR worked prior to on-demand is that we would have kind of like a polling setup where we would be checking every X number of seconds whether we needed to go fetch new content. So maybe that was 60 seconds, for example. We're rendering our page, a new request comes in. Has it been 60 seconds? If yes, maybe we should go fetch new content. With on-demand ISR, it's actually a lot more smart because we can use webhooks to say, when I click comment, fire off a webhook that goes back to Vercel, and it says, hey, just so you know, that content changed. Now go around the world and revalidate and update that static page with the latest content. So when I'm refreshing the page here, you'll notice it's very, very fast. And that's because this is a completely statically generated page that's pushed out to every region in our edge network. And on-demand ISR is giving us the tools to do that. So super, super exciting feature. It has some pretty cool applications. We use it for all of our blog and changelog pages on the Vercel website as well as some other places, but it's a very neat demo. I encourage y'all to check it out and to try it. That's really all I have to say on on-demand ISR. If you have questions about how it works, or if you have any thoughts, I would love to see those in the Q&A and try out the demo and let me know your feedback. The next thing I want to talk about in 12.2 is the new image component. Now, this is a very highly requested update. We've really heard from a lot of the community that they love the image component. They love that it's easier to tackle the challenge of serving images on the web through the components and the primitives that Next.js is providing. Because the reality is, images are really hard. There's many different variations to serve up. There's different image formats to consider, different viewports or page sizes to consider. And if you do images poorly, you can end up with poor performance and bad core web vitals. So the image component's goal really is to give developers a kind of simple React component where they can define their images from some remote location or in their folder, in their repository, optimize those images on demand to use the latest image formats like AVIF and WebP, and make the file size as small as possible to get the best performance, and make that image responsive and maintain aspect ratio. So my dev server is running. I'll go over to pages/image, and you'll see we get this amazing picture of some cats using my favorite service, place kitten. It's really nice if you've seen a placeholder image. And we have an alt tag, which you should definitely add, width and height. Now the image, the difference here with the new image component is that I'm importing from next future image. So what does this actually look like, and why is it different? Well, if I go inspect the output in our dev tools, you'll notice a couple things. One is that there's no wrapping element around the image. This was a big piece of feedback from the community. They didn't want to have any sort of additional DOM elements added. They wanted to have it as close to the native HTML image tag as possible. So the next future image does that. You'll also notice that it uses the loading lazy prop on the image. Now, this is because the browser adoption for native browser lazy loading has become now supported across all major browsers, which means that we have to add less custom JavaScript to the image component to achieve the same effect of only load an image when it's entering in the viewport to get the best performance. For example, we have 200,000 images on a page, but they're way down at the bottom of the page. We only want to load the ones that are in the initial paint for the best core web vitals. And that's kind of the big thing that the new image component is looking to do. Provide a little bit less opinionation about how images are styled and give developers more flexibility and better performance for how they want to handle images on the web. And that's kind of the that's kind of the image component. I know that this has been a point of a lot of feedback from the community. So I just want to say we really appreciate everyone who chimed in on GitHub, on Discord, on Twitter, in our developer community survey, email, carrier pigeon, however you've managed to get in contact with us. Thank you for providing that feedback, because I think the image component is really getting to a good place, and we're hoping to stabilize this very soon. Now, I saved the best for last because I know so many of y'all are extremely excited about layouts. I saw some people in the chat talking about layouts. I saw some in the Q&A asking about layouts. So let me talk about what the layouts RFC is and kind of where we're at today. So the idea behind the layouts RFC is we put this proposal out about 2 months ago that was synthesizing and summarizing multiple years of R&D and community feedback into what folks like about the current routing system and layouts system in Next.js, as well as what they don't like. And the intention is to take all of this and to iterate on a new API and new primitives that make it not only easier to create Next.js applications, but also give you a suite of new tools to get better performance. And that's all synthesized here in the layouts RFC. Now, the reception since releasing this has been very, very positive. I think folks are very excited about nested routing and nested layouts, and just really enabling Next.js developers, enabling you all to build more complex applications with more complex UIs. And we've been working really, really hard on this. Shout out to the Next.js team for really working hard to get this layouts RFC into something that it can be materialized. And I know the community is extremely excited about this. So today I want to actually show you a little demo of how some of these features work and get you very excited about this future. So shout out to Delba for building this very cool demo. She's on the Vercel DevRel team that shows off some of the features of the new Next.js router and support for nested layouts, and also better handling of loading states. I just want to say I love the design here. I think it's super, super polished and very nice to look at. So let's first talk about nested layouts. So I'll click on this, and you'll notice that I have a few different tabs here. We have top level tabs, and we also have nested components inside of those tabs. Now, you've probably seen a lot of web applications that have similar layouts like this. Now, previously, defining this relationship of parent to child layouts and the actual components that was inside them was pretty difficult to do and not very ergonomic. So for example, navigating to this, we want to only have to think about the children or the specific pieces in the electronics section and not have to have some kind of hacky workarounds to deal with layouts. And the new layouts and nested routing support is enabling this to make it really easy to transition between these different nested routes. And as you can see here in the URL, well, we have the actual URL and then we have the visualized URL so you can see the changes. We're able to move through these very, very seamlessly. And now here's the exciting part. Over here, we have some React state. And if I increment this state and I transition between the different tabs, you'll note that I don't lose that React state. So it's actually preserved between these transitions, and only the child or only the children of the layout, aka the page, is re-rendered. And this also works for top level state as well when moving between these tabs. So this is extremely exciting, and this has me very, very excited about adding this to all of my Next.js applications. It's going to make it a lot easier to define the relationships between how my layouts interact with the rest of my application UI. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking, okay, that's cool, but what about when I want to do data fetching? What about when I want to actually pull in some data from some remote location? The answer is you can now do data fetching at the layout level. So if you want to do data fetching just for the books, you can. If you want to do data fetching just for the home section and have it be something completely different, you can. And on top of that, we're adding something very, very cool that is a new convention called a loading file. And the loading file allows you to explicitly define your loading state and make it very, very fast when transitioning between a page that has already been loaded and then a new one that needs to be rendered on demand and have a loading state. Now, in this demo, we've added some artificial delay inside of server rendering so that you can see how it works when using this new loading file. So for example, if I click on electronics, we get into this, I think it's like 5-second loading delay or 3 seconds, and we see the pulsation, and then finally it resolves and we see the new content. Now, the cool thing here is that previously when doing these page transitions, or if you're using other ways of building on the web, when you're doing a complete server rendered transition, you can't maintain state unless you persist it to some state management solution on the server. What's really cool here is, let's say I increment this state, I can actually preserve that across transitions that are happening on the server. So you'll notice that I still have this artificially delayed navigation here, but you kind of get the point of where I'm going at. Now, another cool thing is that with the new app folder and with the new router, transitions are also interruptible. So if I start transitioning to clothing, for example, I can actually, you can see the URL will still update, and I can just jump between these different transitions and actually still cancel the previous transition and say, hey, React, we have some more high priority work that has just came in. Let's execute that instead. And that's really my update on the layouts RFC and the work that we're doing towards the new router. I'm extremely excited about this. I hope y'all are as excited as I am. I think it's going to be a step change, a 10x increase in the productivity of all Next.js developers and the applications that they can build for their customers or their visitors. So I'd love to hear any questions y'all have about this. That kind of wraps up the planned part of the Q&A today. We've got enough time left to make sure that we answer questions. So I'd love to now get into some of these. Does the new layouts support catch-all routes? Yes, it absolutely does. It will be more flexible, a lot more flexible than the current routing support, and enable you to do types of application layouts that were pretty difficult before. Gabriel asked, sending client-side code for an admin app to unauthenticated users has not been great. Can using Edge middleware to send them somewhere else to prevent the admin dashboard code from being sent, is that a good application of Edge middleware? And the answer is yes, that's a great application of Edge middleware, specifically locking down specific routes in your application and just not sending that code or that bundle to them. Other questions, let's see. There was a question here, when nested routing? Well, hopefully my demo has got you excited about this feature. Is it possible to host Next.js on AWS Lambda? The answer is yes. There's a couple different ways that you can do this. Probably the most common would be deploying to Vercel, which does use Lambda under the hood. The next is if you want to self-host on your own AWS Lambda infrastructure, there's a neat open source library called Serverless Next.js that can automate some of the boilerplate to get that set up. I think there's also a Terraform version as well too. And I guess the follow-up there was with S3 and with CloudFront. So you are looking for kind of a self-hosted AWS solution. Yeah, I'd recommend checking out Serverless Next.js. Question on middleware. If using async in middleware and you're fetching from some external location, is performance a concern if the third party is slow to respond? Yes, absolutely. This is kind of the this is the major trade-off with on-demand rendering, whether you're using Edge middleware, you're doing server-side rendering. When you're building your response dynamically on the server using Next.js or any web framework or even a managed WordPress instance, if the connection for fetching that information is slow, you're probably going to have a longer time to first byte or a response from the network, getting something on the screen. So there's been so many solutions that have been created to try to solve this problem. It's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer, but for a lot of folks, we see them trying out something like an ISR or incremental static regeneration because it helps eliminate that category of error of what if my site is slow or what if my database is down? Because if the database is down, you would just continue serving from the previously generated asset. Now you can use caching. Service providers like Vercel have an edge caching layer that you can use to cache responses. So even if the response is slow the first time, it can be faster on subsequent requests. There's a lot of nuance there. Is the Prisma data proxy supported in the Edge runtime? Yes, absolutely. The Prisma data proxy is built on HTTP. It's built on web standards, and it uses fetch to connect to your database. So you can absolutely use that in Edge runtime, as well as other HTTP-based APIs to connect to databases like Supabase, like the AWS Aurora or AWS RDS data API is another one. There's quite a few. Can a rewrite for middleware be used for internationalization without changing the URL? Yes, this is actually a pretty common one for folks who they like the internationalization support in Next.js, but they have some kind of unique requirement that differs a little bit from what's built into Next.js. And the cool thing about middleware is you have complete control over routing. So if you want to do something, that's drastically different, you absolutely can, and have kind of full control over that inside your application. I figured I'd stop sharing my screen, considering just answering questions and keep answering questions here. Let's see what other questions folks have. Should you use middleware on all URLs? For example, setting a country code used for personalization, wondering how that will affect performance. So you absolutely can use middleware on all URLs, especially looking at country codes that shouldn't have, like looking at the properties on the incoming request to see where the visitor is coming from shouldn't have any impact on performance other than like the standard baseline, because you're just kind of reading off some of the incoming values on the response object. So yeah, should be good. What time frame can we expect on updates for layouts RFC? So hopefully the demo today got you a little excited about where we're headed. The goal is hopefully very soon we can share out the next update with a little bit more information on the work that we've done so far, as well as some of the newer things. So for example, today I talked about loading and the loading convention. That hasn't really been outlined or explained much yet. It wasn't in the previous RFC. So we're making a lot of really good progress there. I'm excited to share it. What happens behind the scenes when on-demand ISR and you make a change? So it's pretty cool actually, because in the demo of the GitHub issues, for example, I make a comment on GitHub. This action happens and GitHub says, hey, there was a new issue created, there was a new comment created. Now my repository has a webhook set up that says, it's listening all the time. It says, hey, if this happens, call this URL. And that URL that it's calling is an API route inside my application that's hosted on Vercel. So it calls this API route, says, hey, just so you know, the data changed, you should go invalidate this certain page. And you have in the on-demand ISR route, you have the ability to define what routes you want to revalidate. So in my instance, in that demo, it says, hey, just so you know, the issue changed, go revalidate the index route. Then Vercel, in this instance where I'm hosted, goes and pushes this new version of the static page to every region in our Edge network. I think it's like 20. And they all get these new, every single one of these regions now gets the new statically generated page, and it makes it really fast to fetch it from. Question from YouTube. Hey, everyone tuning in on YouTube, by the way. Can I use the new image component when I don't know the size and I want to render it inside of a responsive parent? So the current state of the experimental version is that you have to define a width and a height, but before it becomes stable, we'll add support for layout fill, which will allow you to do it in that instance. Does the new image component increase or decrease the first contentful paint since the containing element is removed? So the container element on the previous version of the image component was used to help maintain the aspect ratio of the image. I didn't touch on this actually, but the reason that that's no longer needed is because we're able to use the aspect ratio CSS property, which now has cross-browser adoption. So that prevents having to do the containing element just to maintain like a 1-to-1 aspect ratio, for example. So no, it doesn't affect that performance. Is lazy load supported in Safari 2? Yes. I think it's 15.4 is the oldest supported version, I believe. You'd want to check canIuse.com, I think, is the website with the browser vendor support. Is it possible to make middleware run on every request except for some, such as _next? Yes. So by default, middleware runs on every single request. And then you have the flexibility if you want to limit that either on specific routes or in your instance, like on specific files, you can define and denote that through either the matcher config or through just like if statements or conditional statements inside of your function. So some people are excited about layouts. No custom tab layouts. Love to see it. I have an upcoming project where this will be very useful. Glad to hear that that's going to be helpful for y'all. And I see someone on here saying that on-demand ISR helped them save on their costs and reduce their amount of usage and be more cost effective. So I'm glad to hear that as well too. Would love to hear more about server components. That's a great question. So by default, in using this new app layout with the new router inside of Next.js, we're using server components by default. Now, what this means for you as a developer is that you can send less code to the client. So this means better page loading performance when doing server rendering, as the client is having to load less client-side JavaScript, and it's really aligned with the future of React and the new primitives that are being added in the new APIs. So server components are pretty exciting. Still a lot more to be discussed and talked about there, but I'm excited about it. Can you talk about the relationship between React 18 and nested layouts? So with React 18, it's really, we're standing on the shoulders of giants in Next.js because React 18 is giving us these new primitives that are designed for the exact situation the router is built to solve. So for example, when I talked about the loading state and transitioning between pages, React 18 has these primitives to do transitions like start transition that make it very easy for us to enable this deeply in at the framework level. Kind of similarly with server components and suspense, which suspense is giving you like a declarative way to define your data fetching and loading states or your fallback. There's a world where we can kind of merge this world of the explicit loading state inside of Next.js and how that pairs into your suspense fallback. Happy to go into that more too, if you want. What about a polyfill for browsers that don't support lazy loading on the new image component? So if you opt into this component, by default, it's not shipping a polyfill for the browsers that don't support this. So for example, that would mean that Internet Explorer wouldn't be supported with this. That's kind of an option that you could choose as a developer, whether that's a trade-off you want to make. Another question about responsiveness with the image component. I kind of touched on this a little bit with the layout fill support that will be coming. Let's see. There's a few more in here. Will there be support for client components loading server components? So based on my understanding of server components, and I'm still learning more every day, a client component has to be loaded by a server component, because especially in a framework like Next.js, the markup is coming from the server, and then underneath a server component in the tree, you can have X number of client components. That's my current understanding of it, but I'm still learning as I go as well. Can we have localized routes renaming without having to duplicate pages? So I believe this question is around middleware and how they want to rewrite to specific routes without having to have different routes depending on the locale. So the trade-off here is if you use the rewrites approach and you use like multiple paths depending on the locale, so /en/whatever/fr/whatever, and then you rewrite to those, you're able to get better performance since you're pre-generating those pages, and you can push those static assets up to like an edge network, for example. If you don't want to do that, you can edge render all of those pages and build them on demand every time. The trade-off there is potentially in availability. If your database is down, that could be potentially slower. You might need to make sure, well, you probably do need to make sure your database and your functions or your data fetching logic is co-located in the same area. Otherwise, if you're making requests from Europe to US East, for example, there could be some latency there. Are there Node.js shims for the Edge runtime? So the question is around the Edge runtime package we've created that's defining these web APIs for support in Edge environments. How does that work when you're running with Node.js? And the world that we're moving to is where the Edge runtime is a subset of all of the available Node.js APIs as more and more of these things get upstreamed into Node.js. Since we're not there, the Edge runtime is the shim. It's the glue between the expectation and reality, I guess. So it helps patch the gaps on that so that you can build like most people are building today using Edge, or like most people are building today using Node.js environments. Let's see. Thanks for all these questions, by the way. There's so many good questions in here. I think there's still quite a few left, so I'll keep trying to dive through here. Can I revalidate a URL to return a 404? For example, when I unpublish a post? The answer is yes. So inside of get static props, there is a field you can return called not found, which essentially allows it to 404. So if you unpublish a post and you go to revalidate and it triggers to find that it no longer exists, and you return not found, it will then purge the cache, say it's a 404, and yeah. Non-technical question: how is everything around Vercel perfect? First off, thank you. Secondly, we try to achieve perfection. We don't always get there, but it's a good goal to attain for. Part of what I think we do a good job about is trying to maintain a high quality bar and trying to have good quality control. So hopefully most of the things that you're seeing us put out are exceeding your expectations. If they're not, I would love to hear your feedback on where we can do better and try to patch those holes. Does the Edge runtime only support React 18 with streaming? So if you're doing Edge server rendering inside of Next.js, the answer is yes. It only supports React 18, which has support for streaming. If you're wanting to use the Edge runtime for API routes or for middleware, those are supported with any front-end framework using a provider like Vercel. So the answer is Maybe. It depends on your application for it. Other questions or comments? What would the matcher look like with a dynamic URL? Would you be able to have dynamic plus a wildcard like a slug with a star? Yes, you can use regexes to do some of those like star or wildcard based paths in the matcher. Is the star for your matcher inside middleware a good choice to fetch data that is site-wide and then pass that to one of the pages or pass that to all of the pages? So if you want your middleware to run site-wide, I would actually recommend just not using a matcher at all and just removing that entirely, because by default it runs on every request. In terms of fetching your data in a central place and having it available for all pages, what you might actually be looking for is a root layout in the new layouts and new router support. Your root layout wraps your entire application, and you can run a get static props inside of that layout and fetch data for use in your entire application, which I think is a common request of like, how do I fetch data for my navigation bar and put it into my layout and not have to duplicate that logic across pages? So I think that makes sense. Yeah, I think we're about out of time here. We're just about to hit the top of the hour, but just wanted to say thank you, and I appreciate everyone for tuning in today and asking so many amazing questions. Everyone tuning in here in Zoom, those tuning in on YouTube, greatly appreciate it. Would love to continue answering your questions, so feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at LeeRob with 3 E's until I get that 2 E's from that person one day. Or you can email me at lee@vercel.com or go to my website, leerob.io. I can plug a lot of things here, so subscribe to my YouTube channel, smash that like button, subscribe to the Vercel YouTube channel, all that good stuff. Yeah, thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.